booktube, it's Amy. I'm here with an essay. I'm calling it an essay because that seems to be what it is, although it serves as the preface to Private Book Collectors, this directory from 1925 that came in the mail for me yesterday. And it's titled Modern Tendencies in Book Collecting, and it's by George H. Sargent. And I've read just a couple of pages here before I got started, and it is shaping up to be quite interesting. He was an older man than most men are, and had always been a lover of books. In fact, had written some himself, but had never been afflicted or blessed with what Dr. Thomas Frognall Dibdin, who flourished at the beginning of the last century, called with capitals, the bibliomania. In a general way, he knew something about rare books. He was aware that early English printing was valuable, although he had never needed Blade's book on how to tell a Caxton. An Elzevir he held in high respect, not because of Andrew Lang's enthusiasm over the Patisserie Française, but because he had once dropped into an auction room and seen a copy of that famous cookery book sold for $1,000. Of late, the world had been crumbling about him, and he was disturbed by youngsters who openly reviled his favorite Victorian authors and poets, whose irregular lines lacked the smoothness of those whom he knew. He seriously thought of book collecting and of collecting books as a refuge. But in the first catalogue sent him by a second-hand dealer, he found priced at $275 a fine copy of Le Patisserie Française, the famous Elzevir, the mighty had fallen. In Dibdin's synopsis, after the manner of Burton, the author gives his symptoms of the disease of the bibliomania, a passion for large paper, uncut, illustrated, vellum or unique copies, first or true editions, and black letter editions of books. In this complex age, a disease is a much more complicated affair. Where our ancestors simply had stomach trouble, we have one or more of the 57 varieties into which medical science has divided the troubles of the stomach. So our bibliomania is no such simple affair as it was in Dibdin's day, a century ago. His first editions now have as many sections and subsections as any of old Burton's varieties of melancholy. The collector of a century ago would think himself dreaming to see the prices paid now for First Folios and Gutenberg Bibles, and to observe the neglect into which some of his treasured classics have fallen. Our ancestors in powdered wigs, riding in their chaises, doubtless felt the urge of fashion as strongly as the tubular-frocked and bobbed-haired daughters, mothers, and grandmothers of our time. Still, it might be thought that in such a staid and serious affair as book collecting, the world's literature would be exempt from frivolities of this kind. But the whole history of book collecting is a history of the changing tastes of collectors, or perhaps, to put it more accurately, of a new generation of collectors with new tastes. Book collectors, albeit they may appear to the uninitiated to be a strange class of people, are really very human. In their possessions they have pride, envy, a whole host of passions not unknown to other men. We may mourn the passing of what we have come to regard as the old type of collector, but an examination of the catalogues of the libraries which were formed by these men shows that they too were followers of fashion. Dibdin's guide to the selection of a library in which editions of classics now forgotten were considered essential is as out of date as last year's almanac. Today we have annual lists of the best books of the current year, which will perhaps be treasured by the collector of a century hence, not for the selections they contain, but as curiosities of literature. Book collectors have been classified in many ways. Perhaps the simplest is to divide them into those who buy what they like because they like it, and those who buy what appears to be the class of books most likely to appreciate and value. The former class includes men of all ranks and conditions of life, and the desidera of these collectors may be suited to shallow purses and persons of the meanest capacities, as some old textbooks were, according to the announcements on those title pages. The second class includes not only men of large means, but those whose purchases are more limited and yet keen to buy whatever seems to be the fashion among the great collectors, hoping that they are buying in a rising market, whereof they or their heirs may reap the benefit in the auction room. These are largely merely speculators in books, though they would not admit it even to themselves. John Hill Burton, as long ago as the days of our Civil War, ridiculed such pretenders, so that speculation in rare books is not confined to any one time or one country. Such collectors, whether they invest in the listed securities represented by Shakespeare quartos or the unlisted stocks of first editions of modern authors, are simply playing the literary stock market. Their gamble is upon the permanence of a fashion, of a general desire of collectors to obtain the books which they are buying. If they are keen observers and discern signs of a change in the general demand, with the attendant probability of a falling market, off go their treasures to the auction room. But these are not the real book collectors. The revolt against tradition which has encompassed the world in the last decade or two, and which has affected literature by one of those periodical upheavals in which every generation views with more or less contempt the taste of its predecessors, has made many changes in book collecting. This change of taste is a recurrent phenomenon, though many of the present generation seem to regard it as something entirely new that they have discovered or invented. However great the variations of fashion, it is considered necessary to wear at least some clothes. And the history of fashion shows that certain fashions return after a cycle, somewhat altered it is true, but still recognizable. What are the golfers' knickerbockers but a revival of the knee breeches of our ancestors? If there are fewer collectors of the classics, is there no flutter in the auction room when a first edition of Horace comes to the block? Is not an incunabula still an incunabula after all? In the early days of collecting books in England, the great private libraries were composed of religious literature and the classics. Dr. Lazarus Seaman, whose catalogue of 1676 is the first known English book auction sale catalogue, listed 5,639 lots, principally Bibles, and the works of the Christian fathers and early classical writers. Yet it was an age of poetry. Milton had died 2 years before, leaving to the world Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained. Waller's poems had just been issued in a collected edition. Samuel Butler's Hudibras had only reached the second part, but was among the bestsellers. John Dryden's Annus Mirabilis was only a year old, yet no volume of poetry appears in the Seaman catalogue. Robert Greene's notable discovery of Cosenge, 1591, and in brackets, I wonder how that book ever came there, was sold for a couple of shillings, but the whole library shows the contempt of the collector for the writings of his contemporaries, and that early English literature, for which we now pay such high prices, had no attraction for the collector of those days. In the early part of the 18th century, the collectors still held to the classic tradition. Dr. Thomas Pellet's Homer, Florence, 1448, brought £4 15 shillings at his sale in 1744. But there were no books by writers of his time for which, edition exhausted before publication, collectors fought aggressively in the auction room. Even the Caxtons printed in English were passed by for the Latin and Greek authors. A little later, there was a vogue for early printing, and for a time there was a steady demand for the handsome folios and quartos of the first typographers. The highest price paid at auction for a book in the 18th century was in 1789, when Lord Spencer's duplicate copy on vellum of the Faust and Schoeffer Bible of 1462 brought £252. It was a high price for the time, although the similar Hoth copy fetched £3,050 in 1911. A few years earlier, in the Dennis Daly sale, a copy of the first folio of Shakespeare had brought only £30, 14 shillings, and 2D. I always forget what the D stands for. I'm assuming the S is the shillings. Imagine an auctioneer taking a 2-penny bid on a first folio today. The record price for this famous book in the 18th century was £40 19 shillings at the Allen sale in 1789, and the first edition of the quarto Merchant of Venice had brought £2 5 shillings. But the important point is not that these sales indicate a lack of interest in the books which are now so much desired by collectors, but that apparently no work by a contemporary author reached the auction room. After their editions had been exhausted, there was a demand for those great 18th century illustrated books like Buffon's Natural History, which now nobody wants. But outside of France, there was no special demand for the splendid illustrated books, which were produced in Paris in the 18th century, and which are so much in fashion among collectors today. Looking over the sale of catalogues of the time, which are an index to the tastes of collectors, it is surprising to note how few paid attention to the early English literature, which has characterized the collecting of the last decade. Among those who could afford to buy these precious rarities of literature at the record prices which they are bringing today. The literature produced in this country at the time of the American Revolution was neglected by all but a few astute collectors, who kept the cruelly printed and small edition pamphlets, which recounted the history of that struggle. Contemporary literature had few charms for the many who were building private libraries. In England, there was a decided reaction from the classics, which had so long been in fashion. To be sure, early printing was more than ever in favor, but a new fashion had come. Book collecting itself became fashionable. It was the period of the bibliomania, and Dibdin, in his elaborate essay with that title, inveighed in vain against the growing fondness manifested by collectors for tall and uncut copies, and those on large paper. To such an extent had the passion for tall copies grown, that Brunet boasts of a copy of the Elzevir Caesar of 1635 in the Imperial Library at Paris, which was fully 4 10/12 inches in height, whereas the tallest of other known copies did not exceed 4 9/12 inches. We may smile at this now, but cataloguers today measure the first folio in 1/16 of an inch, a survival of a fashion which went to extraordinary lengths, literally and figuratively. And a pause for a sip of my tea here. Another mode of the period was for bindings, which naturally occupy a place in the affections of collectors. One likes to see his favorite books handsomely dressed, but the collection of bindings as specimens of an art was something comparatively new. Dibdin devotes nearly a third of his biographical Decameron to the subject of bindings. The collection of bindings, particularly those which indicate royal ownership, has its fascinations today, which are easily explained by anyone who has seen the splendid examples in the Pierpont Morgan Memorial Library. Good workmanship of any kind will always find appreciation somewhere, and a Grolier binding confers distinction on any library. But, as in the case of many other lines of collecting, there is a wide difference in the prices paid for the armorial bindings which have belonged to the great and those which were made for the near great. The former are more in demand than ever, and the latter less. If one would take the trouble today to make up a work like some of the extra illustrated books of the last century, he would find himself in difficulties at the outset. Many of the plates would simply be unprocurable, and others would require an almost bottomless purse. The publication of Granger's biographical history of England led to a form of the bibliomania which at once received the name of Grangerism. Few collectors today are extra illustrating books, except for their own pleasure, and to embark on such an enterprise with a view to financial reward is indeed a dangerous form of bibliomania. Those works which cost collectors of the early part of the last century so much time and money today go into the auction room to be bought by dealers who tear them to pieces to obtain perhaps a single plate in order to sell it separately. Within the memory of men still collecting, there were those who looked upon the professional extra illustrators like Poole and Toteberg as the only ones who could supply them with the proper sort of a library. But to a large extent this has gone out of fashion, and those who cry for extra illustrated books generally find it cheaper to buy them than to make them. It is curious that one result of the publication of Dibdin's bibliographical works, with their cures for the bibliomania, actually had the effect of increasing the number of victims. After half a century, these same works were collected and the prices paid for Dibdin's in magnificent full bindings were greater than those paid for Shakespeare quartos. It was not until well along in the 19th century that the American collector came to be reckoned with. There had been earlier gatherers of Americana, like the Mathers in Massachusetts and the Birds in Virginia, but when Henry Stevens of Vermont went to London and began picking up the literature relating to the early history of our country, he made Americana the fashion. Through John Carter Brown of Providence, James Lennox of New York, and George Brinley of Hartford, the vogue for collecting Americana led a host of men into a new field, to the very great enrichment of the collectors in some cases, and to that of public libraries in many more. As everything written about the history of our country is included in the term Americana, the field is limitless, and today the Americana collector generally specializes in some particular branch of the subject. Approaching the end of the last century, the term first edition acquired a new and magical interest. Certain collectors, not many but an enthusiastic lot, began picking up the first editions of American and English authors of the 19th century. The number increased as the dealers found here a new outlet for stocks that had long lain on their shelves to gather dust. Leon and Brother, New York dealers, published in 1885 the first price list of first editions of American authors, from which the collector could take his choice at $1.50 of Herman Melville's Typee and the contemporaneous poems of W. Lord. Herbert Stone issued a little handbook of first editions of American authors in 1895, which helped along the demand for such works. Then in 1897 came the issue of P.K. Foley's great work, American Authors 1795 to 1896, which disclosed a large number of American authors whose works had been imperfectly listed by previous writers. The discoveries set dealers and collectors to looking over their stocks or libraries for rare and little-known books of which the first edition brought high prices in the auction room. As in Charles B. Foote's sale, the fashion for first editions did more. It not only enriched the public libraries, but it built up some notable collections for future generations, like that of the late Stephen H. Wakeman, whose rare items brought unusually high prices last season. If the vogue has not entirely passed, the ordinary first edition is unprized today because it may be picked up in any second-hand bookstore and because the demand is satisfied. Yet the highest price ever paid for an American first edition was for Poe's Tamerlane, which brought $11,600 a few years ago. The supply of the great rarities is not equal to the demand. And a little bit more tea here. It is not necessary to consider the deluxe craze of the early part of this century, which impoverished many a would-be collector and ultimately landed some book agents in jail. Those who bought these editions, nominally limited to 26 lettered sets, of which this is A, but actually limited only to the gullibility of the purchasers, were never real book collectors. And I'm going to pause here because late last year I was reading the semi-autobiographical work of Frederick Philip Grove, and he recounts a story of being just one of these sellers who barely escaped, prison time, who is inadvertently at first, not realizing what was happening, inadvertently, he got a job as a bookseller, selling numbered editions of these, rare, special, finely bound books that turned out to be exactly the opposite. They said, we're only selling 86 of these or 100 of these, but number 24 would be sold dozens or possibly even hundreds of times. And the books often weren't made of the material they said they were made of. But moving on here. If one wishes to buy the class of subscription books which wrecked so many plausible book agents, he may find them at bargain prices in the larger secondhand bookstores. The present prevailing demand for first editions of the writings of modern authors is only a variation of the first edition craze of our fathers. The term modern, as applied to first editions, is inexact and too elastic. To one collector, it It includes the later Victorians and the men of the 70s. The 70s would be the 1870s. To another, it would properly be applied only to the works of living authors, a classification which would exclude Stevenson's new form of intermittent light for lighthouses, 1871, and admit Thomas Hardy's Desperate Remedies, published in the same year. But the elasticity of the term lends itself very well to the uses of the auctioneer and the dealer in rare books. I leave it to others to tell what is modern and what is old. Perhaps I am too old myself to know where to draw the line. It is as difficult to say what is modern as it is to tell who are the great authors. In spite, however, of the looseness of our terminology, there is a very general idea of what is meant by modern first edition, and a very general idea and possibly exaggerated idea of its importance and value. It must be borne in mind that the new generation of book collectors which is growing up will be much better equipped at the outset than were its predecessors of former days, even the giants like Brown, Lennox, and Brinley. The old collectors gain their knowledge of rare books by studying their own. Such men are passing, and when we recall such names as Robert Hoe, Samuel P. Avery, Charles B. Foote, Frederick R. Halsey, William Loring Andrews, Stephen H. Wakeman, Beverly Chew, and others, whose fine collections are now dispersed or in public libraries, we wonder whether any such collections are now being formed. Fortunately, we know of younger men today who are doing exactly what these men did, and who have all the aids that can be supplied by ample means of sedulous booksellers, by the catalogues of these same old collectors, and by bibliographies without number. The larger colleges, while not exactly teaching book collecting, are doing much to encourage it among the young men by giving them efficient guidance. Undoubtedly, an increasing number of young collectors will follow the fashion of today, unless a new one is created. To attempt to analyze the present tendencies in book collecting with a view to assisting the young collector to form a library, which will be a profitable investment from a financial point of view, is to venture into a field of prophecy for which I have no inclination, even had I the prescience or the prescience. Most of the books which have been written telling men how to get rich have been the work of writers to whom 3 square meals a day was a great blessing. The new fashions in book collecting are created by men who have made strongly individual libraries, like Stephen H. Wakeman and John Quinn. There will always be a following for such, and there will always be individual collections built up by men who have a distaste for treading beaten paths. But the tendency of the times, as indicated by the annual book prices current, is to collect those rarities of literature, whether old or new, which the owners themselves can enjoy and show to their friends. Good books, well printed and in fine bindings, may be found in almost any line to which the collector may direct his activities. Such books will have a positive and permanent value, enhanced it may be by their provenance, by their being association copies, or by excessive rarity. Collectors are becoming more particular every year about the conditions of their books. The increase of bibliographical knowledge has shown which are the right editions and which are the points which make for correctness. The new collector, if he is wise, will take advantage of the gathered knowledge of the past. Few men will attempt to gather libraries of such rarities as Mr. Huntington and Mr. Morgan brought together. Yet the smallest library may well be selected, and in selecting it to suit his own particular tastes, the collector will gain not only important bibliographical knowledge, but perchance the means of imparting it to others. The collector of modern first editions, whatever that term means, must rely to a large extent upon his own judgment. It is impossible to collect all. Granted that he has a favorite author and has the means of procuring first editions of all that author's works, it does not follow that another generation will support his judgment. Fame is a fickle jade and forgets her darlings as quickly as she has adopted them. There always will be collectors who buy certain books because everybody else seems to want them, without any idea of their present or future literary value. These collectors form a class comparable to those who took up golf when it was first introduced to America and became the fashion. They wore the clothes and spoke the language, but they did not play the game. The collector of moderns must decide for himself whether the works of James Joyce and H.L. Mencken will outlast those of Emerson and Longfellow. The prices paid at auction for some of these modern firsts indicate that there are many collectors who are willing to back with money the living authors and wait for their rewards. There is another class of books which in the last 2 or 3 seasons have attracted a sufficient number of collectors to have caused a perceptible rise in market value. These are books relating to typography and books which are distinguished by their fine printing. The issuing of such publications as the Fleuron in England and the Ars Typographica in this country have done much to raise printing from a trade to an art. The attention of collectors has been drawn by various agencies to the artistic and scholastic sides of bookmaking. The exhibitions of the American Institute of Graphic Art have aroused a popular interest in finely printed books, and the leading typographers of America and England are offering more and more in this line, which is desirable, and much of which, owing to the limited issues, will appeal to the collector with a purely commercial instinct, as well as to the lover of good typography. A couple of seasons ago, an astute auction cataloger, having failed to awaken enthusiasm over the special publications of a noted press, catalogued them as Bruce Rogers typography, and they at once obtained an enhanced auction value. The example recently has been followed by one of the greatest London rare book houses, and as the productions of this typographer, they are priced at figures which make their former records appear low by comparison. There is a pleasure in owning a library composed wholly of specimens of fine printing, and one who specializes in this hobby need not fear the result. A class of books that always have been and always will be in demand among collectors is association books. It is not necessary to explain why one prefers a presentation copy of the first edition of Keats' poems to one without an inscription in his handwriting. The second is a valuable book, but a book merely. The first is a human document as well as a valuable book. Association books are in a class by themselves, and while fashion may affect the popularity of any author, a volume associated with one upon whom fame has set her seal of approval will always be valued. Some of the autographed copies of today's favorites may pass ultimately into a lot of miscellaneous books, 100 volumes, many autographed, but when the great have been sifted from the near great in the winnowing mill of time, the books which have been associated with the former will be a source of pride to the owner and of envy to his fellow collectors. Similarly, those books which have been preserved for years in great collections will always be a source of pleasure to their possessors and will find a ready market. These are pedigreed books which stand in the same relation to ordinary copies as does the prize-winning registered jersey to the common scrub cow. In the first place, the fact that a book has been in a great collector's library is an indication of the merit of its contents. Second, it is likely to be well bound or otherwise in collector's state with all the necessary points. Then, too, it is very probably a well-preserved and clean copy. And finally, it has, by its very environment, acquired a certain security of position which gives it distinction, like an earl whose family antedates the Norman conquest. Such books, I think, will be even more sought in the future than in the past, and the collector of the future must be prepared to pay a high price for any old book from the Christie Miller Library simply because it has been treasured by its former owner at Britwell Court. A century ago, incunabula and early printed books were high in price when set beside the first edition of a contemporaneous author. Today, the prices of these early productions of the printing press seem low by comparison with other collectors' books. Under the natural operation of the law of supply and demand, the worthwhile books of the first century of printing from movable type will operate to keep such books valuable. A few discoveries may be recorded, but of the 40,000 titles of books printed before the year 1500, many thousands will pass each year out of the reach of the collector by reason of their absorption into public libraries. As for early English literature, the present high values are not likely to be affected in any marked degree by the discovery of new copies, for the larger libraries stand ready to take any that may be left by the wealthy private collectors. The first folios and quartos are nearly all recorded, and those who despair of securing such treasures are even now collecting the folios of Ben Jonson and Beaumont and Fletcher. There is an immense bulk of early English literature written by able writers, which can be secured cheaply today, but which will be costly tomorrow. Long ago, in the columns of that literary weekly, The Critic, March 13th, 1886 to be exact, there appeared a little poem by one who was not a poet, but an ardent book collector. It was dedicated to J.H.P. J.H. Purdy, and its grave pronouncement has stood the test of time. The writer, Beverly Chew, was not a rich man, as the term goes now, but he collected 2 magnificent libraries, one of which was bought en bloc by Mr. Henry E. Huntington, while the other, sold last season after Mr. Chew's death, realized $159,229. And these lines by Beverly Chew may well be taken to heart by the modern collector, whatever his chosen hobby. Old books are best. With what delight does Faithorn Fessett greet our sight, on frontispiece or title page, of that old time when on the stage, sweet Nell set Rowley's heart alight. And you, O friend, to whom I write, must not deny, and though you might, through fear of modern pirates' rage, old books are best. What though the prints be not so bright, the paper dark, the binding slight? Our author, be he dull or sage, returning from that distant age, so lives again, we say of right, old books are best. And that is the end of that. We have, down at the bottom here, Elm Farm, Warner and H, October 1st, 1925. And it's true, old books are best. And so I hope you enjoyed that.